friends, I am Dr. Shonali Chandra and I welcome you all to our YouTube channel Medicine Decoded. Now, in clinical practice, we often encounter patients with thyroid disturbances, more so hypothyroidism since it's more common, more particularly in the northern Indian belt of our country. So when I'm dealing with pregnant women or women with menstrual hormonal disturbances, I often find it clinically very relevant for myself also to know more about thyroid physiology. So let's get started and talk about the thyroid hormones and the thyroid gland. Now, thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped gland. Here it's an endocrine organ which is present in front of the trachea here. Right? And the hormones it produces are the thyroid hormones. And they're very important hormones because they take part in various metabolic processes of our body. They stimulate oxygen consumption by the tissues. They increase the metabolic rate. They regulate, carbohydrate, lipid, fat and protein metabolism as well. And they also are very, very important because of these very reasons in growth and development, especially in the younger children and during the time of pubertal development. Now, the thyroid hormones that are secreted, they are rich in iodine-containing amino acids. It's structurally a protein hormone. So, iodine is a very important component of the hormone, and we get this iodine from our diet. The amino acid is tyrosine to begin with, and through various series of steps involving incorporation of iodine into the amino acids, we get various intermediate forms like MIT monoiodothyronine, DIT diiodothyronine. But these intermediate forms, they are not secreted from the thyroid gland. The hormones that are secreted are T3, triiodothyronine, and T4, that is thyroxine, and trace amounts of reverse T3. Okay, so when I talk about the hormones that are secreted, 93% secretion is that of thyroxine, T4, and on an average, 7% of secretion is that of T3 hormone. Now, the difference between the two is mainly in how potent they are, how rapidly acting they are, So basically, there is a difference in the intensity and rapidity of action between these two forms, that is T3 and T4. So let's go into that a little bit deeper as well. So when I talk about the action of thyroid hormones at the tissue level, okay, the hormone that is going to act on the tissues, the more biologically active form of the hormone is T3. So that is the one that acts on tissues on site, right? So when thyroid hormone is supposed to act on the tissues, much of this T4 is converted to T3 to be able to act on the tissues. Okay, so if you compare between the two, then a T3 is 4 times more potent than T4, than thyroxine, than T4, right? Now, since it's more potent, it need not be in too much amount in circulation. Okay, very little amounts in circulation are there. So it is lesser in amount in circulation, and it is also very rapidly acting, quick action of this hormone. See, it's supposed to act on tissues, so it's rapidly acting. It also lasts for much lesser duration in the circulation. Okay, it's quickly metabolized, so it has a shorter half-life as well. So let us look at the functional anatomy of the thyroid gland here. Okay, so we're looking at the anatomy of the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland is composed of numerous follicles, and these follicles are lined by cuboidal epithelial cells. Now, this is follicle, which is the site of thyroid hormone synthesis. Now, the follicle also secretes into the lumen a substance that is proteinaceous, glycoprotein, that is called as colloid. Now, this colloid is rich in a glycoprotein, which is called as thyroglobulin. Now, the other things that you see in the diagram, we have the blood vessels, underlying stroma. We have these parafollicular cells, C cells, which secrete calcitonin, but we're not talking about that. Let's focus on the follicle here, the site of hormone synthesis. So iodine that is present in the bloodstream is going to enter into the thyroid follicle cells, right? The cuboidal epithelial cells, and is going to be used up for thyroid hormone production. We're going to talk in detail about that. But yes, something very important here is what is the trigger. So if you look at this diagram here, from the anterior pituitary, we get the TSH hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, this happens in response to TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, which is coming from the hypothalamus and stimulating the anterior pituitary to increase the production of TSH. And it is TSH hormone that is acting on the thyroid gland to make it, to stimulate it to produce more thyroid hormones. So TSH stimulates all aspects of thyroid hormone production, beginning from the increasing uptake of iodine from the bloodstream into the follicular cells, a phenomena that we call as iodide trapping. So we're going to talk about that also. So now let's just have a look at this in a little more detail. This is a single thyroid follicular cell that we are seeing. This is the blood vessel nearby, single follicle cell. This is the nucleus of the cell. This is the lumen of the follicle here. Now, thyroglobulin is a glycoprotein, which is present, yes, in the colloid here, agreed. Now, that thyroglobulin is coming from the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi body complex of the follicle cell, the cuboidal epithelial cell. It's packaged into secretory granules and it is released into the colloid, and that is where it is stored. Now, the colloid here is composed of thyroglobulin, and it is on this thyroglobulin molecule, which is rich in tyrosine amino acid residues. It is on the molecule, this molecule, that thyroid hormones are going to be synthesized, and thyroid hormones are going to be stored in the colloid till they are needed. That when they're needed, that is when they will be secreted. Now, let's just go a little bit more into detail. Now, let's assume here we're going into more detail here. So, this is the thyroid follicular cell, let's say, and this is the bloodstream, let's say. Okay. So, iodide has to move in to the follicle cell, and this happens against a concentration gradient, right? Because the iodine concentration is higher in the follicle cell rather than the bloodstream. Okay, so this requires energy, ATPase, and coupling of ions like that, right? So we have a transport protein here, which is called as NIS. NIS for short form. It stands for sodium, and for Na, sodium iodine symporter. So iodide moves in, it's trapped inside now. Now this iodide has to move in. This is colloid here. Let's label it thyroglobulin molecule. So iodide has to move in. Now again, transport protein is required at this point in time. This is what we call as chloride iodide exchanger, also called as pendrin. Okay, pendrin. Now, the iodide that has been released into the colloid needs to be oxidized before it can be incorporated into the thyroglobulin. So this will get oxidized in the presence of another enzyme here. Okay, another enzyme here present towards the lumen of the follicle. and this is thyroid peroxidase enzyme. Now, once this is oxidized, it can be incorporated into the thyroglobulin molecule, and then we will get various products like MIT and DIT. These are not secreted, but T3, T4 are also there, that are also released. Now, these hormones are stored on this molecule. It is on the structure of this molecule thyroglobulin, which is a glycoprotein, that these hormones are synthesized, and they're stored there in the colloid till they are needed. Now, these stores of thyroid hormones, that is the colloid, they last for us for about 2 months, even without thyroid hormone gland production of hormones. Now, if you have a look at this image and understand, you'll realize here that it is because of TSH hormone that, iodine uptake into the cells is increased, right? The activity of the enzyme and production of the hormones is increased. And eventually, yes, the hormones need to be released into the circulation. And for that, the colloid will be, there will be reuptake of colloid into the follicular cell by endocytosis and digestion of the thyroglobulin molecule and the release of T3 and T4 into circulation. The rest of the thyroglobulin molecule will be repackaged and recycled. The hormones like MIT and DIT, these intermediate products, they are not released into the circulation. They're also digested. The iodine in MIT and DIT, that is also recycled and reused for further hormone production. All right. So what do we see here? We see here that iodine uptake is an important step, important part of the process. And therefore, if there is a deficiency in iodine, there is going to be a deficiency of thyroid hormone production. Agreed? Now, the minimum requirement of iodine that is required on a daily basis is about 150 micrograms per day. And in societies where there is deficiency of iodine in the groundwater in the diet, then yes, iodine deficiency and consequently thyroid hormone deficiency can develop. But in today's society nowadays, with widespread iodization of salt, and we're all consuming iodized salt, our requirements are mostly met. And if you have a look at this, considering the hormone production here, if you look at this more closely, you'll realize if there is an autoimmune disorder where there is increased autoantibody synthesis. I mean, there could be autoantibodies against thyroid peroxidase, thyroid peroxidase antibodies, anti-TPO antibodies, or if there are anti-thyroglobulin antibodies, or if there are antibodies targeting the TSH receptor, anti-TSH receptor antibodies, then there will be destruction of thyroid gland, something that we call as autoimmune thyroiditis, right? And the follicles are going to be destroyed. So initially, when autoimmune thyroiditis occurs, initially, this stored colloid, this stored hormone, that is released into the circulation. So initially, there is this release of stored hormones. But eventually, yes, with autoimmune thyroiditis, long-term hormone deficiency is going to set in. Okay, so I hope this is conceptually clear. Now, moving on, let's talk about how these hormone acts in the tissues, right? So once these hormones are released into the circulation here, okay, now these are the free forms that are released into the circulation. Free forms of the hormone are the metabolically active form. They are the ones who are going to act on the tissues, right? But in the circulation, they are quickly bound to their binding proteins. Now, these binding proteins are synthesized from the liver. Now, what are these binding proteins? These are mainly thyroid binding globulin, but yes, hormones bind to albumin and transthyretin also. So, all in all, about 99% of the thyroid hormone in circulation is the bound form. Okay, and about the rest is the free form of the hormone. Okay, now like I told you that it is the T3 hormone that acts on the tissues. Okay. So one thing very important to remember here, because the T3 has to be made available to act on the tissues, obviously it needs to quickly convert to its free form. Then only T3 will be able to act. Thus, we can conclude that T4 has a stronger binding to the binding proteins as compared to T3. Okay. So T4 has a stronger affinity for the binding proteins as compared to T3. Since T3 is less strongly, or let's say loosely bound to the binding proteins, at the tissue levels, it becomes quickly available in the free form to be able to act on the tissues. Okay. Secondly, T3 can directly enter the cell and then the nucleus to act. T4, on the other hand, needs to be converted to T3 at the tissue level. And this is done by removing one iodine here from the molecule, and the enzyme is deiodinase enzyme. So now the T3 moves into the nucleus. So thyroid hormones act like steroid receptors. They act on nuclear receptors. So we have a thyroid hormone receptor inside the nucleus, and inside the nucleus the action is going to be transcription of DNA. It is going to be production of new messenger RNAs, whatever the target cell is. Okay. So ultimately there will be more of protein synthesis in the cell. Now these new proteins, they can be a variety of types. They can be structural proteins, enzymes, transport proteins, and others, right? So ultimately you realize that the net result of all of this is an increased functional capacity of the tissues throughout the body, wherever the target organs are. And all in all, yes, there is an increased metabolic activity. Okay. So when you say increased metabolic activity, metabolism increases, okay, in almost all the tissues of the body. And with metabolism, what is generated? Energy, calorie. So yes, thyroid hormones is a caloriegenic hormone. Now let us look at it a little bit more deeper into the important metabolic activities where thyroid hormone has a role to play. And I first want to start with the central nervous system, the brain. And the thyroid hormone has a very important role to play in brain development, more particularly in the fetus, in our fetal lives, and in infant lives, right? So very, very important point to note here that thyroid hormone is very essential, very crucial for normal brain development. In adults, it has a role to play in mental alertness. It has important role to play in sleep as well, growth in young children and adolescents. It has a role to play in fat mobilization and breakdown, again contributing to increased calorie production. It has an important role to play in metabolism of glucose, again for calorie production. So thyroid hormones, they contribute to increased absorption of glucose from the gut. They also play an important role in increased utilization of glucose at the tissue level, at the cellular level. So increase the uptake of glucose by the cells as well. And in that process, increased release of insulin from the pancreas is also promoted, again because of contributory effect of thyroid hormones as well. Thyroid hormones play a role in utilization of glucose by increasing glycolysis, glycogenolysis also, right? So again, the net result is increased energy production, calorie generation, and metabolism. It also increases the motility of the gastrointestinal tract, increase digestion. It is responsible and has a key important role to play in increased muscle reactivity, our reflexes, right? so has a role to play in the synaptic transmission of impulses. It has a role to play in the contractility of the muscle as well. It has a role to play in decreasing serum cholesterol and triglycerides, right? So that it does so by increasing the cholesterol and triglyceride excretion in the bile. So that's how decreased serum cholesterol and triglyceride. So normal thyroid hormone production maintains cardiovascular health also. And if you have a look at this, you'll realize that, whenever the metabolism in the body is increased, there is heat generation, there is energy production, right? So yes, oxygen has to move to the tissues. Carbon dioxide, which is the end product of metabolism, needs to be removed from the tissues and circulation, right? And waste products that are formed as a part of metabolism, they need to be removed from circulation. So all in all, the blood flow to the tissues increases. Yes, of course. And for that, yes, the cardiac output also increases. So there is increased contractility of the heart. There is increased strength of contraction. There is also an increase in heart rate. So when we have increased metabolism, we have an increased heart rate and an increased contractility of the heart. And because, there is a lot of vasodilatation that happens with metabolism, increased metabolism, and that helps because, heat needs to be dissipated from our body. So yes, thyroid hormone has an important role to play in regulation of body temperature as well, okay? And because oxygen consumption has to be met, so there is an increased rate and depth of respiration at the same time as well. And if you look at the menstrual cycle regulation and thyroid hormone doesn't have a direct role to play in menstrual cycle regulation, but thyroid hormones can affect the blood levels of other hormones. They can affect the levels of sex hormone binding globulin proteins, and therefore they can play an indirect role in menstrual cycle regulation. So with this, we see how thyroid hormones, they contribute to so many variety of aspects of our bodily functions and metabolism. And in the next video, we are going to talk more about what happens when the hormones are in excess or what might happen when the hormones are deficient.